Most injured animals cry out, they whimper, they yelp, they let the world know they're hurting. But Rex just lay there on the cold concrete floor of the Kennel Bay at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, his dark eyes open and steady, his breathing shallow and careful, like he was trying not to bother anyone. Like he had already decided that his pain wasn't worth the noise. Staff Sergeant Maya Renner had seen that look before, not in animals, in people, in soldiers who had been taught by someone somewhere that asking for help was a sign of weakness. She recognized it because she had worn that same expression herself, more times than she could count. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, and the air outside had that particular bite that rolls through North Carolina before the leaves finish falling sharp and clean and unforgiving. Maya had arrived at the Kennel Bay at 5:30, same as every morning, same as she had for the past 3 years. She was the senior handler for Military Working Dog Team Bravo, responsible for 2 dogs and the daily coordination of the kennel section's training schedule. She had earned that position through 6 years of service, 2 overseas deployments, and a record that was, by any objective measure, exceptional. None of that seemed to matter to the people in charge of her building. She set her bag down on the bench outside Rex's kennel and crouched low, studying him through the chain-link door. Rex was a 7-year-old Belgian Malinois, a veteran of 2 combat tours in Afghanistan. He had a chest full of service history and a scar along his left flank that told a story nobody had ever fully written down. He had been assigned to the kennel section 6 months ago after his previous handler rotated out, and in that time he and Maya had formed the kind of bond that doesn't need words. Which was why she knew, the moment she looked at him that morning, that something was very wrong. His water bowl was untouched. His food from the night before sat exactly where the evening handler had left it. His breathing was measured, too measured, the kind of deliberate rhythm a creature uses when each breath costs something. And when Maya opened the kennel door and knelt beside him, he didn't rise to greet her the way he always did. He just turned his head, looked at her, and blinked slowly. She ran her hands carefully along his sides. When she reached his lower abdomen, he stiffened just barely, just for a second, but she felt it. "Okay, buddy," she said quietly, "I've got you." She stood and walked directly to the kennel office, where Sergeant First Class Dale Prout was sitting behind his desk with a cup of coffee and a pile of paperwork that he didn't appear to be reading. Prout was the kind of man who had decided, somewhere around his 14th year of service, that the military owed him comfort. He was broad-shouldered and slow-moving and wore his authority like a coat he'd borrowed from someone else, too big for him, but he refused to admit it. He had never deployed to a combat zone. He had never worked a dog in the field. He had taken command of the kennel section 8 months ago through a combination of seniority and internal politics, and from the very beginning he had made his opinion of Maya Renner quietly but consistently clear. She was too young, too eager, too confident for someone who was, in his words, just a dog handler. "Rex needs to be seen," Maya said, standing in the doorway. "He's showing signs of internal distress, could be bloat, could be something else, but he needs a vet check today, this morning." Prout didn't look up from his paperwork. He had his quarterly check 2 weeks ago. He was fine. "He's not fine now." "Renner," he set down his pen with the slow deliberateness of a man performing patience. "I've been doing this since before you were in high school. Dogs have off days. Give him till noon, and if he's not eating, we'll call the vet." "Sergeant, if this is GDV." "It's not GDV. You haven't looked at him." He did look up then, not at her exactly, more through her, the way some men look at women they've already decided not to take seriously. "I don't need to look at him. I need you to go do your morning checks and let me handle the schedule. Can you do that?" Maya stood very still for a moment. She was 31 years old, 5'6", with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun and brown eyes that in that moment were doing a great deal of work to stay neutral. She had been in rooms like this before. She had stood in this exact posture, straight-backed, measured, swallowing what she actually wanted to say more times than she could remember. She turned and went back to Rex. Maya Renner had grown up in Clover, South Carolina, a small town about 30 miles southwest of Charlotte, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and felt entitled to have an opinion about your choices. Her father was a retired Army mechanic. Her mother had worked at the county hospital for 22 years. There were no grand stories in her family history, no generals or war heroes, just ordinary people who showed up, did the work, and went home. She had enlisted at 18, not out of desperation or lack of options, but out of something she could never quite explain except to say that it felt like a calling. She wanted to serve. She wanted to be part of something larger than herself, and she had been good at it consistently, demonstrably, provably good. But the military, like any institution, has its politics. And one of its oldest and most persistent politics is the quiet, grinding skepticism applied to women who move through its ranks with too much competence and not enough apology. Maya had encountered this her first week in basic training when a drill sergeant told her she threw like she was trying not to break a nail. She had encountered it at her first duty station when a senior NCO suggested she had received her first commendation because someone liked the way she smiled. She had encountered it in Afghanistan when a Special Forces sergeant had asked her, the night before a joint patrol, whether she was sure she could handle it, and she had looked at him calmly and said, "I've been handling it," and gone to bed. Each time she had absorbed it, not because she agreed, not because she was weak, but because she understood something that took some people a lifetime to learn. Dignity is not something other people can take from you. They can insult it, underestimate it, and refuse to see it, but they cannot take it. What sustained her through all of it was the work, the actual, concrete, irreducible work of what she did every day, training the dogs, running the evaluations, writing the reports that told the truth about performance and readiness. She trusted the work didn't have politics. And the work that October morning was telling her that Rex was in serious trouble. She spent the next 2 hours doing her assigned checks while keeping one eye on him, documenting his behavior in the kennel log with the specificity she'd been trained for: time, symptoms, observations. At 8:10, she called the base veterinary clinic herself, not through Prout's office, directly, and described what she was seeing. The vet tech on the line, a young specialist named Camilla, listened carefully. "That does sound concerning," she said. "Can you get him in?" "I'm working on it," Maya said. She went back to Prout. He was now standing near the coffee machine talking to Corporal Jenkins, a younger handler who laughed too readily at Prout's jokes and had not yet realized what that was costing him. They both looked up when Maya entered. "Talked to the vet clinic," Maya said. "They want to see him. Tech says his symptoms are consistent with an early-stage intestinal obstruction." Prout's expression shifted, not toward concern but toward something else. Irritation, maybe, the specific irritation of a man who doesn't like being made to look like he missed something. "You called the clinic," he said. "Yes, Sergeant. Without going through me. I documented my request to you at 5:35. You declined. Rex's condition has not improved. I made a judgment call." The room was quiet for a moment. Jenkins looked at the floor. "You made a judgment call," Prout repeated, slowly, like he was examining each word. "Yes, Sergeant." He set down his coffee cup. "Renner, I want to be very clear with you. In this section, requests go through me, calls to the clinic go through me, you don't go around me, you don't make executive decisions about animals that aren't your primary assignment. Do you understand?" "Rex is in pain, Sergeant." "Do you understand what I just said?" She held his gaze for exactly 1 second longer than comfortable. "Yes, Sergeant." "Good, I'll decide about the vet after lunch." He turned back to Jenkins as though she had already left the room. She went back to Rex. She sat on the floor beside him, her back against the kennel wall, and she put her hand on his side very gently so she could feel the rhythm of his breathing. He exhaled slowly. She thought she felt in that exhale something like trust, the particular trust of a creature that has decided, for reasons it cannot articulate, that this specific human will not abandon it. She had no intention of abandoning him. What she did instead was this: she took out her personal phone and began photographing the kennel log. She photographed Rex's untouched food and water. She photographed his posture and his eyes. She wrote down the time and everything she had said to Prout, word for word from memory, in a small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket, a habit she had developed years ago for exactly this kind of moment. Then she waited and she watched, and she kept her hand on his side so he'd know he wasn't alone. By 1100, Rex had deteriorated. His abdomen was visibly distended. His gums had gone pale, not dramatically, but enough. His heart rate, when Maya pressed her fingers to the pulse point on his inner thigh the way the vet techs had shown her, was elevated and thin. He had shifted to panting in short, careful bursts. She walked to Prout's office for the third time. He was on the phone. He held up one finger without looking at her. She stood in the doorway and waited. He finished his call, something about a scheduling conflict with a training block, nothing urgent, and turned to her with the expression of a man who had decided that she was, today, his primary inconvenience. "Rex is crashing," she said. "His gums are pale, his abdomen is distended, his heart rate is elevated. This is a medical emergency. I am requesting permission to transport him to the vet clinic immediately." Something in her voice, not volume, not anger, but a kind of absolute certainty, made him pause. For just a moment the performance of authority slipped and she could see something underneath it, not compassion, uncertainty. It lasted about 3 seconds. "Fine," he said, "take Jenkins with you, fill out the transport form first." "There isn't time for." "Fill out the form, Renner." She filled out the form. It took 4 minutes, she timed it. Then she and Jenkins loaded Rex into the transport vehicle, and Maya drove faster than she was supposed to, and she did not care even slightly. The base veterinary clinic at Fort Bragg occupied a low brick building near the far end of the installation, the kind of place that always smelled of antiseptic and dog, and something underneath both of those things that was harder to name, the particular smell of creatures that cannot speak being looked after by people who have chosen to listen anyway. Dr. Anita Vasquez met them at the door. She was a compact woman in her late 40s, with close-cropped silver hair and the unhurried, careful manner of someone who had seen enough emergencies that panic no longer served her. She had been the installation's chief veterinary officer for 11 years. She had worked with hundreds of military working dogs, and when she looked at Rex, still, pale, breathing shallow, her expression went from greeting to concern in a single second. "Get him into exam 2, she said, "right now." What followed was 65 minutes that Maya spent in the waiting area doing the hardest thing she knew how to do, which was nothing. She sat in a plastic chair and stared at the floor and did not allow herself to catastrophize, because catastrophizing was a waste of energy that Rex needed her to preserve. Jenkins sat beside her for a while, then got up and got coffee from the machine in the corner, then came back. "He's going to be okay," Jenkins said. Maya didn't answer. Not because she was rude, but because she genuinely didn't know if it was true, and she had never been able to offer comfort she couldn't stand behind. Dr. Vasquez came out at 12:47. "Intestinal obstruction," she said, sitting across from Maya with the directness of someone who respected your ability to handle the truth. "A good-sized one. He must have ingested something, a piece of toy maybe, or a training equipment fragment. We're going to need to go in surgically. He's stable right now, but this needed to happen today." She paused. "If you'd brought him in this afternoon, Maya, we might have been having a different conversation." Maya looked at her steadily. "I tried to bring him in this morning," she said, "at 5:35. Dr. Vasquez held her gaze for a moment, then she wrote something down on the clipboard she was carrying. "I'll note the timeline in the record," she said quietly. It was a small thing, it was an enormous thing. Maya nodded once and looked back down at her hands. Outside, the October wind was pushing leaves across the parking lot in small, spiraling drifts. Jenkins was looking at his phone. The waiting room hummed with fluorescent light and the distant sound of a dog somewhere in the back, not crying, just breathing. Maya sat in that plastic chair and thought about a question she had been asked once, years ago, by a chaplain at her first duty station. He had been an older man, soft-spoken, with the kind of eyes that had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it. He had asked her, "What keeps you steady when everything around you is trying to knock you sideways?" She had been 23 and she hadn't known how to answer. Now, 8 years later, sitting in a veterinary waiting room while a dog she loved was being operated on because someone in authority hadn't listened to her, she thought she finally understood. It wasn't stubbornness, it wasn't anger, it wasn't even pride, though people often mistook it for that. It was simply this: she knew what she knew, and she had stopped apologizing for knowing it. Rex survived the surgery. Dr. Vasquez called it textbook, difficult but clean. He would need 6 to 8 weeks of recovery and restricted activity, but his prognosis was excellent. When they brought him out afterward, groggy and shaved along his belly and wearing the particular expression of an animal that has been through something serious, but has decided with great dignity not to make a fuss about it, Maya put her hand on his head and he leaned into it just slightly. "Hey," she said softly, "I told you I had you." He blinked at her, that slow, deliberate blink. She drove back to the kennel section alone. Jenkins had caught a ride back earlier. The sun was going down over the installation, turning the brick buildings the color of old copper, and the wind had picked up. When she walked into the kennel office to submit her paperwork, Prout was still there. He looked up. "He make it," he said. "Yes, Sergeant." He nodded once, went back to his paperwork. She set the transport form and the vet report on his desk. She had clipped to it neatly a copy of the kennel log showing the 5:35 entry. She had said nothing about it. She didn't need to. She walked out of the building into the October dark and stood for a moment in the parking lot, breathing the cold air, feeling the particular exhaustion of a day that had required too much and given back very little, except for the one thing that mattered. Rex was alive. She had done her job. That was enough for tonight. But she also knew, with the same quiet certainty she'd carried all her life, the same certainty that had kept her standing in doorways and writing things down in small notebooks, that this was not over. Something had started today, something that had been building for a long time. And she was going to see it through. By the following Monday, Maya had heard from 3 separate people that Prout was describing the previous week's events in a particular way, a way in which his version of the timeline was somewhat different from the documented one. In his retelling, he had recognized Rex's distress and initiated the transport. Maya had been emotional and difficult to manage. The unauthorized call to the vet clinic had been a violation of protocol that he was, graciously, choosing not to pursue formally. She heard this from Jenkins, who told her with the awkward discomfort of someone delivering news he wished he didn't have to deliver. She heard it again from Specialist Tours in the administrative office, who mentioned it while pretending to be interested in the coffee machine. She heard it a third time, most painfully, from Sergeant First Class Donna Hale, one of the few women in the section at her rank, who stopped her in the hallway and said, gently but with warning in her eyes, "Watch yourself, Maya. He's building something." Maya thanked each of them. She went back to her desk. She opened her notebook. She wrote down what she had heard and when and from whom. She had learned something years ago about institutions. They move slowly and they have long memories. And the best weapon available to someone without power is documentation. A paper trail is not exciting. It is not dramatic. It does not feel like justice in the moment, but it is the thing that makes justice possible later. She kept doing her job. She kept it immaculate. She arrived earlier. She stayed later. She submitted reports that were precise and thorough and completely irreproachable. She said good morning to Prout every day with the same even tone. She did not avoid him. She did not antagonize him. She simply continued to exist at the highest possible standard of her position because that was the only language that couldn't be argued with. Rex came back to the kennel section after 3 weeks of recovery, supervised by the vet clinic, walking with the slightly careful gait of an animal that has been through something serious but has decided to put it behind him. When he saw Maya, his whole body changed, not the wild, leaping energy of a young dog, but something quieter and more profound. A recognition, a settling. "You're a tough old thing," she told him, checking his incision with the practiced gentleness she'd developed over years of kennel work. He put his chin on her knee. She understood in that moment that whatever happened next, whatever Prout was building, whatever the rumor mill was producing, whatever complications lay ahead, she had already done the thing that mattered. She had been there when it counted. But the complications, as it turned out, were considerable. The formal complaint was filed in November. It was framed as a concern about protocol adherence and chain of command violations, and it named Maya specifically. It cited the unauthorized call to the vet clinic, the insubordinate tone during her conversations with Prout, and what it described as a pattern of unilateral decision-making that undermines unit cohesion. It did not mention Rex. It did not mention the timeline. It did not mention what Dr. Vasquez had written in the veterinary record. Maya was called into the company commander's office on a Thursday afternoon. Captain Harrison was a rangy man in his late 30s who had the particular quality of someone who had been promoted for administrative efficiency and was not entirely comfortable with the parts of command that involved human complexity. He sat behind his desk with the complaint printed out in front of him and the expression of a man who would have preferred to be somewhere else. "You understand why you're here," he said. "Yes, sir. SFC Prout has raised some concerns about your conduct during the Rex incident. I'm aware of his characterization of events, sir. I have documentation of mine." She placed her notebook on his desk, not dramatically, just set it down, open to the relevant pages, along with printed copies of the kennel log, the time-stamped photographs, and a copy of the veterinary record that Dr. Vasquez had provided at Maya's request, with the timeline clearly noted. Harrison looked at the documents. He was quiet for a moment. "This is fairly thorough," he said. "I try to be accurate, sir." He picked up the vet record. He read the note Dr. Vasquez had added. He set it back down. "I'll need to look into this further," he said. In the meantime, I want to make sure things in the kennel section are functional. I'm going to suggest that you and SFC Prout work through your communication issues and... Sir, Maya said carefully, with respect, the issue isn't communication. The issue is that a dog nearly died because a medically urgent situation was dismissed, and the person responsible for that dismissal is now attempting to frame that dismissal as my misconduct. The room was quiet. Harrison looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. I understand what you're saying, Staff Sergeant, he said finally. Give me some time to review the record. She stood, straightened her uniform, and left his office. In the hallway outside, she stood very still for a moment, breathing. Her hands were steady. Her heart rate was slightly elevated but manageable. She had told the truth, she had told it calmly and with evidence. She had done everything right. Now she had to wait. Waiting, she had come to understand, was its own kind of discipline. In the first week of December, something unexpected happened. A joint training exercise was scheduled between the kennel section and a visiting Navy SEAL element, a routine attachment for specialized dog integration training. These joint exercises happened a few times a year, and they were generally straightforward. The SEAL teams wanted to understand how to work with military dogs in operational environments. The kennel section provided handlers and dogs. Everyone exchanged knowledge and went home. The SEAL element that arrived on a cold December morning was led by a senior chief petty officer named Marcus Webb. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, lean and weathered, with gray at his temples and the unhurried movement of a man who had learned, through very hard experience, to conserve energy. He had been a special operations combat medic for most of his career before transitioning into a training role. He had worked with military working dogs in 3 different theaters of operation. He was also, Maya noticed within about 15 minutes of the exercise starting, someone who watched carefully before he spoke. The exercise that morning involved scenario-based detection work, the dogs moving through a mock building, handlers working them through a search pattern, the SEAL element observing and asking questions. Maya was running Rex carefully, given his recent surgery with Dr. Vasquez's clearance for light duty, and they were working well, Rex moving with his customary focus quiet, Maya reading his signals with the fluency that comes from real partnership. Prout was standing off to the side with Senior Chief Webb providing the official commentary. Maya could hear fragments of it as she worked. The handler's name, the dog's history, the training protocol, standard briefing information. Then she heard clearly, she's a good handler, little bit headstrong, still learning to work within the team structure. She kept her focus on Rex, she kept her face neutral, she did not look over. But a few minutes later, during a water break, Senior Chief Webb walked over to where she was standing with Rex and crouched down to greet the dog with the practiced ease of someone comfortable with working animals. Rex, who was selective with strangers, allowed it, sniffing Webb's hand and then sitting back with an expression of mild approval. He came back fast from that surgery, Webb said. He looked up at Maya with dark eyes that were, she realized, a great deal more attentive than his posture suggested. I heard about what happened. The exercise went well, Maya said carefully. Webb studied her for a moment. He had the quality rare she'd found and worth noting when she encountered it of someone who wasn't performing listening. He was actually doing it. Can I ask you something? He said. Of course, Senior Chief. He was quiet for a beat, still crouching beside Rex, one hand resting lightly on the dog's shoulder. Then he said, when you were standing in that kennel office at 5:35 in the morning trying to get someone to listen to you, what kept you going back? It was not the question she expected. She had expected something about the protocol violation or her working relationship with Prout or some version of the gentle interrogation she'd been subjected to repeatedly over the past weeks. This was something else entirely. She thought about it, genuinely thought, because it deserved a genuine answer. He trusted me, she said. Rex, he couldn't ask for help himself, so I was going to do it for him no matter how many times I had to walk through that door. She paused. I don't know how else to explain it. Webb looked at her for a long moment, then he stood up, nodded once and said, that's enough. She wasn't entirely sure in that moment what he meant. She understood later. Senior Chief Webb had been in the special operations community long enough to recognize 2 things on sight: someone who was competent and someone who was being undermined. In his experience, these 2 things occurred together more often than most institutions like to admit. He had asked his one question not because he needed the answer, he had already formed his assessment, but because he wanted to hear how she answered it, what she led with, what she chose to explain. She had led with Rex, not herself, not her record, not the injustice, not the politics, the dog, the trust. That told him everything he needed to know. Webb spent 3 days at Fort Bragg for the joint exercise. In that time, he watched Maya Renner work with a professional attention that she wasn't aware of and wouldn't have changed her behavior for anyway. Which was itself informative. He talked to Dr. Vasquez, who was direct and clear about the veterinary timeline. He talked to Jenkins, who was honest in the way young people are honest when someone older asks them a straight question with the clear expectation of a straight answer. He even talked to Prout briefly over coffee in the way that two senior NCOs sometimes talk, obliquely, reading between lines, each measuring what the other is not saying. What he gathered when he put it all together was a picture that was not complicated. It was, in fact, very simple. The simplest stories often are. On his last morning at Fort Bragg, Senior Chief Webb stopped by the company commander's office. He and Captain Harrison talked for 45 minutes. Maya was not in the room. She did not know this conversation happened until later. What she knew at the time was that the joint exercise concluded, the SEAL element departed, and she went back to her kennel duties with the same disciplined consistency she had maintained for the past 6 weeks. What she did not know was that Webb had asked Harrison a question, a different question, not the one he'd asked Maya, but equally simple. He had asked, if this dog had died and the timeline showed what the documentation shows, would you be comfortable explaining your decision-making to the command? Harrison had been quiet for a long time after that. The investigation was quiet. It always is when an institution is examining itself, not loud and dramatic, the way people sometimes imagine, but careful and contained and conducted in offices with closed doors. It took 3 weeks. Maya was interviewed once formally by a major from the Inspector General's office, a composed woman named Fitzgerald who had asked her questions in the same even, unhurried way that Webb had, and who had looked at her documentation with the careful attention it deserved. She had answered every question directly and completely. She had not embellished. She had not editorialized. She had simply told what happened in the order it happened, supported by every piece of evidence she had methodically gathered. When the interview was over, Major Fitzgerald had thanked her, stood, shaken her hand, and said, "You kept good records." "I learned early that it matters," Maya said. Fitzgerald nodded. "It does." The results came in the second week of January on a morning when the North Carolina cold had settled in seriously, a gray sky and frost on the windshields in the parking lot and a wind that meant business. Prout was reassigned, not quietly, not without consequence, formally, with a letter in his record. The investigation had found that his handling of the Rex incident represented a failure of supervisory judgment that had directly endangered a military working dog's life, and that his subsequent characterization of Staff Sergeant Renner's conduct was not supported by the available evidence. Maya was formally cleared of all misconduct allegations. Captain Harrison had submitted, through official channels, a commendatory note regarding her handling of the situation, her documentation, her persistence, and her advocacy for the animal in her care. It was careful, measured language. It was also coming from the same office that had initially seemed inclined to smooth things over, not nothing. She read the clearance letter in the parking lot, sitting in her car because she had not wanted to be seen reading it, in case her face did something she wasn't prepared for. It did. She let it for about 45 seconds. Alone in the cold car, she pressed her fingers to her eyes and breathed through it, not crying exactly, but releasing something. The accumulated weight of months of being doubted, documented, investigated, whispered about, and dismissed. Then she straightened up, folded the letter along its original crease, and put it in the glove compartment. She went inside. Rex was waiting in his kennel, standing now, moving with the confidence of a dog who had healed and remembered that he was capable. When she opened the kennel door, he came to her immediately, not frantic, not dramatic, but with the direct and settled gladness of an animal whose trust has never wavered. She knelt down and put her arms around his shoulders. "We're okay," she told him. He turned his head and pressed it against her cheek. In the weeks that followed, the kennel section found its footing under new management, a sergeant first class named Okafor who had come up through the handler program and had the particular quality of someone who knew what good work looked like because he had done it. The section ran smoother. The documentation improved across the board. Jenkins, freed from the ambient pressure of a leadership environment that rewarded performance of loyalty over actual competence, turned out to be a thoughtful and capable handler. Maya did not gloat. She did not hold the past up as a trophy. She simply continued to work, continued to train, continued to show up at 5:30 and leave when everything was done and the animals were well. Senior Chief Webb sent her a brief message through official channels in late January, a professional courtesy note, the kind of thing that gets sent routinely between elements after joint exercises. Inside it, he had added a handwritten line at the bottom of the printed form. You already knew the answer to the question, that's the whole point. She read it twice, then she put it in the same envelope as the clearance letter. Rex was medically evaluated in February and cleared for full operational duty. He ran his certification course with the focused, purposeful intensity that had always defined him, a veteran animal who knew exactly what was being asked of him and intended to deliver it. He passed with top scores in his category. Afterward, Maya stood at the edge of the training field with him sitting at her feet, both of them breathing the cold February air, and she looked out at the installation, the brick buildings, the bare trees, the pale winter sky, and felt something that she didn't have a precise word for. Not triumph, not vindication exactly, something quieter than those things. She had been doubted, she had been dismissed, she had been officially investigated for doing the right thing, she had stood in doorways and been looked through. She had written things down in small notebooks and submitted paperwork and been told in 100 different ways that she didn't quite measure up, didn't quite fit, didn't quite deserve the confidence she carried. And she had kept going, not because she was unaffected, she wasn't, not because it didn't hurt, it did, but because she knew what she knew, and what she knew was this: the work matters, the dog in front of you matters, the truth of what you observe and what you document and what you fight for when everyone is telling you to let it go, that matters. And sometimes all it takes is one person asking the right question, not a complicated question, not a clever or strategic one. Just a simple question asked by someone who is actually listening at the right moment. What kept you going back? She had known the answer before she finished hearing the question. Rex stood up beside her, shook himself once, and looked up at her with those steady dark eyes. All right, she said, let's go. They walked back together across the frost-pale field toward the kennels, the woman who had refused to stop and the dog who had taught her without a single word what it meant to bear pain in silence and trust that someone would notice.